Earthlings are used to everything: strange weather anomalies, crazy headlines in newspapers, and even the unexpected appearance of new types of coffee. But meeting aliens who came to Earth solely to taste whiskey was beyond human comprehension. They arrived on an unusual ship that looks like a giant toaster, which, judging by its appearance, has already burned several times. The spacecraft landed with a deafening spit in the center of the little velvet town of Longboat, Kentucky, the capital of whiskey and home cooking. 3 men emerged from the ship: Zapp, long as a telegraph pole and resembling a giant neon cucumber, a spherical blue-green Glock, and a rather diminutive but somehow commanding Persia, who looked as if her head had been modeled after a watermelon rind. "We come in peace," Persia said in her electronic voice. "But first, give me a whiskey." The locals, of course, thought it was some kind of prank at first. But when Glock used his laser to accidentally melt the town's horse sculpture into a metal puddle, it was clear that messing with aliens was not worth it. Joe the bartender, who worked at a local bar called the Drunken Bourbon, didn't hesitate. He quickly placed 3 glasses of the amber drink on the bar. Welcome, guests from," he stammered, trying to figure out where they were from, but Zapp kindly prompted. "Zetaforia. We are tasters on a galactic scale. We heard about your whiskey and decided it was time to give it a try." The trouble started immediately. Glock tried to drink the whole glass, but since he had neither mouth nor stomach, the drink just flowed down, forming a sticky puddle on the floor. Zapp spent a long time trying to figure out why the whiskey was on fire, after the bartender lit a Cuban cigar next to the glass, and Persia seemed unfazed by the fact that the drink resembled motorcore cleaning fluid. "People," she said, struggling to swallow a second sip, "is this ambrosia or a weapon of mass destruction?" Joe the bartender shrugged. "Depends on how you drink it." And so began the funniest night in Longbelly's history. It turned out that the aliens not only had a poor tolerance for alcohol, but also had some very strange reactions to alcohol. After 3 drinks, Zapp began to perform something resembling a galactic breakdance, Glock began to glow all the colors of the rainbow and attract moths, and Persia suddenly announced that she intended to open her own bar on Zetaforia. At some point, one of the locals suggested they play karaoke, and that was the turning point. Glock performed something that could be called a musical disaster, and Zapp attempted to play the saxophone, although he actually used a water pipe. When morning came, the guests thanked the Earthlings for the unique experience, promised to return with a galactic license to sell whiskey, and left. However, they took with them several barrels of bourbon for research. The next morning, the residents of Longbelly had a long discussion about whether it was an invasion, a tasting, or the beginning of an intergalactic festival. Joe, who had barely closed his bar after the night before, was already a local legend. Meanwhile, on Zetaforia, a story of its own had begun. Persia, back home, immediately launched an intergalactic startup called Zeta Whiskey, Drink and Shine. Glock was appointed chief drink tester, and Zapp was put in charge of marketing, which boiled down to putting up huge neon signs with captions like, "Feel the burn. Whiskey, the road to parallel worlds." Now with fewer side effects, hopefully. However, it turns out that the problem isn't just learning how to drink whiskey properly, but also the production of it. The Galactic Food Safety Council, an agency famous for its love of bureaucracy, has made a claim. This drink is causing havoc in the biological systems of most creatures. Rumbled the voice of an inspector from the planet Florb who looked like a cabbage in a tie. Yesterday, 3 Merfet inhabitants ate your gift sets and now think they're light bulbs. Persia smiled her most diplomatic watermelon smile in response. It's just the side effects. Culture shock, if you will. The Council has given a time limit of 1 Zetafor week, equivalent to Earth's 2 days, to fix it, to make the whiskey less dangerous. The problem became even more complicated when Glock decided to experiment. He thought that whiskey was not stellar enough, so he added some antimatter to it. As a result, half of the planetary capital was illuminated for 3 days, and the drink had the effect of levitation. The drinker began to slowly float. This innovative product was called flying bourbon, but it was quickly banned because all the tasters had their heads on the ceiling and couldn't get down. Zapp suggested an alternative: mix the whiskey with the popular Zetaforia gin. The result was deplorable. The drink began to sing songs instead of getting drunk. And the songs were always about lost love for asteroids, and after a couple of minutes any listener would go into a depression. Realizing that they were getting nowhere, Persia decided to turn to Joe again. They flew in at night when the bar was closed, but Joe had been waiting a long time. "I knew you'd be back," he said, happily pouring himself a mug of coffee. "Did you screw up?" "A little," Persia admitted. "We need help." Joe looked at them skeptically. "Whiskey isn't just a drink, it's an art. You can't mix it with antimatter or a gin that sings. But we need something unique." Glock exclaimed indignantly, still glowing after one of his experiments. Joe wondered. "Do you know what makes whiskey special? It's not just the flavor, but the process. The barrels, the aging, the patience. You want it to be instant, but that breaks all the magic." Joe then gave them a tour of a real distillery where they learned how the drink is aged, how they choose the right wood for the barrels, and how it is drunk, in small sips, not as a funnel. Back on Zetaforia, Persia and her team decided to redo everything. They started using the galactic equivalent of oak for barrels, accelerated the aging process with gravity waves, and added pure earthy warmth instead of gin songs. The new drink was a hit. Its slogan sounded simple: Zeta Whiskey. For those willing to take a risk. And Joe was invited to be the guest of honor at the first intergalactic liquor show. However, he never managed to go there, because his bar was visited by new visitors from outer space, who also wanted to try that ambrosia. The Intergalactic Festival of Spirits was an event that attracted beings from all corners of the universe. The Zetaforia was packed with tasters, vendors, and just curious guests, many of whom had never even heard of whiskey. The bar that Persia built in the center of town was called the Star Barrel. It was a huge establishment with transparent walls so that visitors could admire the views of space while they sampled Zetaforia's new hit. The problem started as soon as the first guests arrived. "I'm sorry, but my body can only digest liquids with a temperature of at least 500 degrees, said the fire giant from the planet Flamba. "I have another problem, I need gaseous drinks," added the inhabitant of the planet Mermal, who looked more like a transparent bubble with eyes. Persia, smiling, explained. "Whiskey is a universal drink. We will find an approach to each of you." For the fire giants, they created a version of whiskey with a plasma shot that burned at 600 degrees Celsius. Guests from gaseous life forms received whiskey smoke, which they inhaled instead of the traditional drink. And for creatures that fed exclusively on light, Zapp developed a special cocktail that emitted an iridescent glow. But the most popular drink was Galactic Storm, a cocktail of Zetaforia whiskey with stardust, which they extracted from the nearest asteroid. The drink had a pleasant shimmer and a slight levitation effect, which did not scare anyone else. The festival culminated in a cocktail-making competition. Joe, who came at Persia's invitation after all, was the center of attention, demonstrating classic recipes like the Manhattan and the old-fashioned. "Simplicity always wins," he said as he watched Zapp try to mix whiskey with liquid helium. But the main surprise awaited the guests in the evening, when the Galactic Karaoke began. After 2 servings of Galactic Storm, even the most silent aliens started singing. The fire giant performed an opera aria that almost made the bar explode, and Glock, as usual, lit up with all the colors of the rainbow and became the center of attention, dancing something like a waltz. The festival ended up being a grand success, but it was not without its problems. The Galactic Council, though they approved the new product, began to receive complaints. My grandfather started claiming he was the king of Zetaforia after your whiskey. And my pet started saying he wanted to open a bar. Persia and her team took it with humor. We're just inspiring the galaxy, she said. However, the bureaucrats were relentless and imposed a rule that every planet must obtain a license to sell Zetafor whiskey. This only fueled interest, whiskey became scarce and its price multiplied.